Leave your city or country in the comments and join us on this journey. Each region has its own way of understanding the mystery, and your participation makes it all the more exciting. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, take this opportunity to subscribe and turn on notifications. The mansion stood isolated in a forgotten area of New York State, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to have grown more out of sheer stubbornness than life itself. It wasn't the kind of place that immediately caught your eye, but it didn't go unnoticed either. There was something wrong with the way the wind avoided lingering there, as if even nature recognized that this space didn't belong to the ordinary world. The property owner, Richard Halverson, was a billionaire known for his almost obsessive discretion. Unlike other tycoons, he didn't appear at events, didn't give interviews, and maintained a minimal public presence. His fortune came from technological investments and the quiet acquisition of bankrupt companies that, under his leadership, returned to prosperity. To the world, he was a strategic genius. To those who knew him closely, he was a cold, methodical, and extremely reserved man. Nobody knew for sure why he bought that mansion. The property had been abandoned for over 40 years. Records indicated that the last family who lived there left in a hurry, leaving furniture, personal belongings, and even clothes behind. No official explanation was given at the time, only an unsettling silence that persisted for decades without being questioned. Richard bought the place outright, without negotiation. A few months after the acquisition, the renovations began. Trucks arrived in the early morning hours, carrying equipment and materials that no one could clearly identify. Workers were hired for short periods and dismissed before they could establish any kind of relationship. None of them stayed for more than 3 days, and they all came out different. Some avoided talking about what they saw inside. Others simply disappeared from the records after the job was finished. One of them, however, broke the pattern. An electrician named Daniel Cross was found days later, sitting on the porch of his own house, staring blankly into space. When he finally spoke, his words were disjointed, but laden with a terror that was difficult to feign. He said the house was breathing. The statement was ignored by the authorities, treated as exhaustion or possible substance use. The case did not progress. Richard continued his work without any interference. Then, on a cold November morning, Richard Halverson simply disappeared. No ransom demand, no sign of a break-in, no bank transactions. His car remained in the garage. His electronic devices were intact. It was as if he had evaporated inside his own house. The news spread rapidly. The press tried to turn the case into a scandal, but the lack of concrete information made any solid narrative difficult. That's when an independent investigative team decided to act. Among them was Laura Bennett, an investigative journalist known for getting involved in cases that most avoided. Unlike the others, she wasn't only interested in the billionaire's disappearance. What caught her attention was the pattern surrounding the mansion, the workers, the fragmented accounts, and the property's strange history. Laura didn't believe in coincidences. Upon arriving at the property, the first impression was one of abandonment, but not the usual kind of abandonment. Everything seemed too intact, too organized, as if someone had left just minutes before. The main door was unlocked. That didn't make sense. Inside the house, the silence was dense. There was no accumulated dust as expected. The floor was clean, the furniture was neatly arranged, but something was out of place. Not visible, but perceptible, like a presence. The team began documenting everything. Photographs, videos, notes, every detail could be crucial. However, as they moved through the corridors, the feeling of unease grew. It wasn't outright fear, but a constant restlessness, as if they were being watched. It was underground that they found the first concrete evidence that something was deeply wrong. The door leading to the basement was reinforced by a modern metal frame, clearly installed after Richard's purchase. It wasn't just a door, it was a barrier, and it was locked from the inside. Laura approached slowly. The air there was colder. A metallic smell, almost imperceptible, lingered in the air. One of the team members tried to force the doorknob, without success. It was then that they noticed something engraved on the inner surface of the door, visible through a small opening between the metal and the old wood. It didn't look like it had been made with tools. They were irregular marks, as if someone had tried to write with their fingernails. Laura used the flashlight to illuminate better. The words were incomplete, shaky, but legible enough to cause an immediate silence in the team. "Don't let them open." Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Then a dry thud echoed from the other side of the door. He wasn't tall, but it was impossible to ignore. Laura Bennett wasn't the type of journalist who merely sought sensational headlines or superficial stories. Her reputation was built precisely on going beyond the obvious, investigating patterns, connecting overlooked details, and above all, persisting where others gave up. Over the years, she had covered cases of corruption, unexplained disappearances, and even clandestine operations that never came to public attention. Even so, there was something about that mansion that triggered a different kind of alarm, something more instinctive than rational. The team accompanying her was small but highly competent. Marcus Doyle, a specialist in digital forensics, was responsible for recovering any technological traces left by Richard. There was also Ethan Cole, a former police officer with experience in missing persons investigations, whose cautious demeanor contrasted with Laura's almost obsessive curiosity. Together, they formed a balanced group, accustomed to dealing with complex situations, but none of them were prepared for the kind of environment they were about to face. The mansion, despite being partially renovated, still preserved evident traces of its past. The Victorian architecture, common in old properties in that region of the United States, featured long corridors, high ceilings, and a room layout that favored shadows and blind spots. During the day, natural light barely managed to penetrate the windows, which were covered in layers of dirt and wear. At night, the place took on an even more oppressive atmosphere, as if darkness became part of the house's very structure. While exploring the upper floors, Marcus managed to access part of the internal system installed by Richard. What they found was unusual. There were cameras scattered throughout practically the entire house, except in specific spots, such as the hallway leading to the basement and some interior areas, without logical explanation. These blind spots didn't seem like system flaws, but deliberate choices. Richard had monitored everything, except precisely the most suspicious places. Furthermore, the available video recordings presented something even more unsettling. In several recordings, Richard could be seen walking around the house in the early hours of the morning, always alone, always silent. However, at times, he seemed to stop midway, as if he were listening to something. On other occasions, his posture changed abruptly, as if he were reacting to the presence of someone who did not appear in the images. Ethan was the first to verbalize what everyone was thinking, albeit in a restrained way. It didn't seem like just a disappearance. There was a progressive behavior, almost like a psychological deterioration recorded in real time. Meanwhile, Laura focused on another detail, the documents found in the main office. Among financial papers and business contracts, there were personal notes, something extremely unusual for someone as reserved as Richard. The pages didn't follow a logical order. Some contained dates, others just loose phrases written hastily as if recorded in moments of urgency. One of the notes read, "She wasn't here before." Another, more disturbing one, appeared to have been written repeatedly over several days. "The sound comes from below." These sentences were not enough to form a complete explanation, but they clearly indicated that Richard was dealing with something he could not control or understand. The investigation also revealed details about the mansion's past. Old records indicated that the property belonged to the Whitmore family, a traditional lineage that abruptly disappeared in the 1970s. There were no official records of violence, but neighbors from that time reported strange behavior in the months leading up to the house's abandonment. Lights left on in the middle of the night, sounds coming from the basement, and sudden changes in the residents' behavior were frequently mentioned in archived reports. Curiously, these reports were never taken seriously by the authorities. Laura noticed a pattern beginning to form. Decades earlier, an entire family had abandoned the house after inexplicable events. Years later, a highly rational billionaire acquired the property and, in a short time, began to show signs of instability before disappearing completely. Now they were there, following the same steps, exposed to the same environment, and possibly due to the same unknown factor. Tension within the team began to grow silently. Small noises started to attract more attention than they should have. Doors that seemed to shift slightly, drafts in enclosed spaces, and the constant feeling that something was out of reach, watching their every move. Nothing concrete, nothing that could be proven, but enough to change everyone's behavior. Still, Laura didn't back down. On the contrary, her determination intensified. For her, this was no longer just a journalistic investigation. There was a hidden truth in that house, something that resisted time, explanations, and attempts to ignore it. And everything indicated that this truth was directly linked to what lay behind the locked door in the basement. Richard Halverson's disappearance transformed the mansion into a place charged with almost palpable tension. Each room Laura and her team explored seemed to amplify the unease, and the feeling of being watched grew with each passing moment. The subtle noises, distant footsteps, creaking wood, the faint echo of doors moving made the atmosphere unpredictable and dangerous. What began as a journalistic investigation was now turning into a psychological test, capable of challenging anyone's sanity. The security systems Richard had installed revealed more than they expected. Hidden cameras showed movement inside the mansion itself, but strangely, certain areas such as narrow corridors and corners of the basement remained outside any monitoring. It was evident that Richard knew something no one else did, and now his absence left a dangerous space of uncertainty. The team felt for the first time that they were dealing with something that wasn't limited to the rational. It wasn't just a missing person, but an environment that seemed to react to human presence. While exploring the main library, Marcus found old records about the mansion's first inhabitants. Books, diaries, and handwritten notes revealed a disturbing pattern. Accounts of whispering voices, objects moving on their own, and shadows appearing without explanation. It was impossible to determine whether these events were the result of superstition or something more concrete. But the coincidence between these occurrences and the recent disappearances of workers hired by Richard could not be ignored. Each detail added layers to the conflict, making the investigation more complex and risky. At the same time, the team faced internal challenges. Ethan began to question the group's safety, warning about the risks of remaining in the mansion after nightfall. The tension increased, not only because of the invisible presence, but also because of the accumulating psychological pressure. Laura, on the other hand, felt that every hesitation could compromise the chance of discovering the truth. The conflict was not only in the environment, but also in the dilemmas of each character, between caution and obsession, fear and determination, rationality and instinct. The first major obstacle arose when they tried to open the basement door. Traditional tools were useless against the metal reinforcement Richard had installed. The silence behind the door was almost suffocating, and a strange chill ran down everyone's spine. Something inside refused to be disturbed, and the simple act of trying to force entry seemed to provoke a reaction from the environment. Doors creaked on upper floors, drafts swept through isolated corridors, and shadows seemed to move in the corners of their peripheral vision. Each failed attempt increased the feeling of helplessness, transforming the search into an increasingly distressing experience. Furthermore, new signs began to emerge that the mansion was not merely a static setting. Objects moved inexplicably, furniture appeared in different positions, and strange odors permeated certain rooms. Marcus recorded everything with cameras and sensors, but even the data seemed insufficient to explain the events. It was as if the house itself was aware of their presence, evaluating each action and reacting unpredictably. This unpredictability intensified the conflict, forcing each team member to grapple not only with the mystery of the disappearance, but with a reality that seemed to defy all known laws. Laura began to realize that the main conflict was not only external, but also internal. The mansion, with its history of disappearances and unexplained phenomena, pressured each of them to confront personal fears and limitations. Ethan showed signs of mental fatigue, questioning decisions he had previously made with confidence. Marcus dealt with growing frustration as he tried unsuccessfully to record evidence. Laura, in turn, struggled to maintain focus as the tension threatened to erode her objectivity. Each challenge reinforced the complexity of the conflict, making it impossible to distinguish where the mansion's influence ended and where the psychological effect on the investigators began. And in the midst of this escalation, unsettling clues emerged. Fragments of torn papers, partially corrupted audio recordings, and strange marks on the floors indicated that Richard was not alone in the days leading up to his disappearance. But these clues did not reveal a conventional human presence. On the contrary, they suggested something that escaped rational comprehension, something that inhabited the shadows and moved according to unknown rules. The threat intensified with each discovery, and the feeling that they were about to cross a critical line grew stronger. While exploring the upper floor, Laura found a room that seemed forgotten by time, filled with old belongings and furniture covered in yellowed sheets. There, the walls displayed almost imperceptible inscriptions, marks that seemed to have been made in desperation. Some of them mentioned Richard directly in truncated messages like, "Don't trust, don't look, she's watching." The tension reached a new level. They were not only dealing with a disappearance, but with evidence that Richard had perceived something extremely dangerous and possibly supernatural. The mansion, until that moment silent, seemed to finally show clear signs of its hostility. And then, at the end of a narrow corridor, a different noise interrupted the team's advance. A continuous, metallic sound echoed from the basement, rhythmic, almost pulsating. Laura realized it wasn't just a random noise, but a warning. The escalation of the conflict had reached a point where ignoring signs was no longer an option. Every action of the team was being observed. Every move could trigger something unexpected. And in that instant, it became clear that the real challenge was only beginning. As the main tension grew surrounding Richard's disappearance and the mystery of the mansion, smaller subplots began to emerge, intertwining almost invisibly with the central conflict. Laura, reviewing old records of employees who worked on the renovation, discovered that some disappearances were not random. There were patterns in dates, names, and roles that suggested certain individuals were somehow selected to deal with what was hidden in the house's cellars. Each new disappearance brought not only an additional mystery, but also a layer of urgency. It was no longer just about Richard, but about a cycle that seemed to have been repeating itself for decades. The complexity of the environment also manifested itself in the team's relationships. Ethan began to suspect Marcus, not out of malice, but because of his cautious behavior that turned into excessive hesitation at critical moments. Laura realized that under pressure, each personality reacted differently, creating internal tensions that threatened to jeopardize the investigation. The discussions were silent, expressed more in gestures, glances, and small communication breakdowns than in words, but every detail contributed to the unfolding drama. The mansion, in some way, amplified these human flaws, making them vulnerable not only to what was external, but also to what arose within each of them. As the team delved deeper into the mansion's corridors and halls, more explicit signs began to emerge that something in Richard's past and the history of the house was connected to forces that could not be ignored. Documents found in an old safe revealed unusual transactions and letters with unknown symbols, possibly related to the purchase of the mansion. It seemed that Richard had tried to interact with it before disappearing, perhaps even to understand the threat, but had failed to decipher its magnitude. Each discovery added layers of complexity to the narrative, connecting past, present, and an uncertain future in an intricate board of enigmas. Furthermore, small stories from long-time residents began to intertwine with the investigation. Neighbors reported seeing lights turn on and off by themselves at strange hours, or hearing indistinct footsteps and voices coming from the property. Some swore that decades ago, children had disappeared without explanation. Each account seemed fragmentary, but together they formed a disturbing pattern that Laura and her team couldn't ignore. The subplot of the mansion affecting the outside world created a domino effect. More people began to realize that the property was not just a physical space, but an epicenter of inexplicable events. As the team advanced, the time pressure also intensified. The cold of the underground seemed to deepen as night fell, and time seemed to pass differently inside the mansion. Small signs, clocks running slow, surveillance cameras with temporary malfunctions, notes that mysteriously disappeared, heavied the sense of urgency. Every minute mattered, but the team didn't know exactly what they were racing against. It was a silent, invisible race against something that couldn't be measured or predicted, and this constant pressure turned every decision into a dilemma. Amidst all this, an unexpected discovery further heightened the narrative tension. Laura found a hidden room behind a movable bookcase, a kind of secret library that seemed to have been planned by Richard. Books in ancient languages, ritual objects, and enigmatic notes suggested that he had attempted to access forbidden or unknown knowledge. Some of these items seemed to have been prepared to stop something, or perhaps to summon something. The complexity of the conflict now extended beyond the disappearance. There were elements that challenged not only comprehension, but the very reality they knew. Even with these discoveries, smaller subplots began to partially resolve themselves. Ethan, confronting his own growing fear, made the decision to protect his colleagues in critical moments, showing inner growth. Marcus managed to recover data from corrupted cameras, revealing subtle patterns of movement that seemed to anticipate events inside the mansion. Laura, in turn, realized that she would need to combine this scattered information to move forward. Each small resolution brought clarity, but also raised new questions, maintaining the intense pace and tension-filled narrative. At the end of the day, as the team reviewed what had been collected, it became clear that all the subplots converged on the same point: the basement. Every piece of evidence, every strange behavior, every past or present disappearance, every historical record, and every inexplicable manifestation pointed to that space as the epicenter of the mystery. And yet, no one knew exactly what they would find when they opened the door, or if they would manage to get out of there unscathed. The mansion seemed to pulse in response to their actions, each step taken to unravel the secret, making the situation more dangerous, more complex, and more urgent. Night fell with an unusual, almost suffocating density, enveloping the mansion in a cloak that seemed to absorb all available light. Laura and her team had already explored every accessible corridor, reviewed every digital and physical record, and yet the basement door remained the epicenter of the mystery. Until then, every strangeness, every noise, and every shadow fit into a pattern of growing yet still contained threat. That's when something completely unexpected broke the thin line between observation and direct danger. One of the security cameras, previously damaged, captured a fleeting presence inside the basement itself. An indistinct figure that moved too fast to be human, but whose form resembled Richard. The initial shock froze the team. Marcus checked the slow-motion feed, replaying the recording dozens of times. There was no doubt something was there, something that seemed conscious but wasn't entirely corporeal. Laura felt the air around her change. The mansion, until then a hostile environment, now seemed aware of their presence, watching, almost playing with them. Ethan breathed heavily, his fingers tense around the flashlight, while Marcus tried to record every detail without losing his composure. The feeling was that this turning point not only altered the narrative of Richard's disappearance, but completely redefined the risk they faced. Soon after, a low, metallic sound began to echo through the basement, an irregular rhythm, as if something were banging or being dragged. The noise was deep, reverberating off the stone and wooden walls of the mansion, but impossible to pinpoint. Laura moved forward, feeling each step as if she were traversing a dense fog. With each corridor, the air seemed heavier, laden with a presence that couldn't be seen but felt. There was something down there that wasn't limited to Richard's disappearance, something ancient, intelligent, and hostile, reacting to her investigation. And then came the revelation. By partially opening a side passage in the basement, Laura found a series of records that Richard had deliberately hidden. They weren't just documents, but evidence that he was trying to protect something, or perhaps keep something confined. Among coded notes and strange symbols, a disturbing detail emerged. Richard didn't disappear by accident. He was drawn into the mansion by something he himself couldn't control. And even more shocking, the record suggested that the billionaire had discovered the existence of a conscious presence in the house, capable of manipulating time, space, and even human perception. The turning point became even more intense when a new event erupted without warning. An entire wall trembled, small cracks appeared as if the house were physically breathing, and a previously static door opened on its own. The cold air emanating from the basement hit everyone abruptly, as if the mansion were expelling them, testing their limits. Ethan tried to rationalize, but instinct prevailed. This was not just a physical space, but an entity, a force that Richard had faced alone and that was now observing them directly. As Laura walked down the hallway toward the basement, a figure appeared in the reflection of a broken window. For a moment, she believed it to be Richard, but the image was distorted, as if the very presence of the mansion shaped its form. It wasn't the billionaire they knew. It was something derived from his essence, a shadow of the man who had disappeared, with human features, but manifestly supernatural. The visual confrontation lasted only seconds, but it was enough to redefine everyone's perception. The mansion didn't just hide Richard's disappearance, it hid the very reason for his disappearance. From that moment on, everything changed. The mission to discover what had happened transformed into a fight for survival and understanding. Every corridor, every door, and every shadow took on a new meaning. It wasn't just about evidence or accounts. The mansion interacted with them, tested their limits, and imposed its presence as an invisible but overwhelming force. The turning point not only altered the direction of the story, it shattered the logic the team knew, forcing them to confront a reality where every action had immediate and unpredictable consequences. And amidst all this, Laura understood that the key to understanding the mansion lay not in logic or technology, but in how Richard had tried to protect himself, and failed. The billionaire had entered a game that they now needed to play as well, with rules that would only be revealed gradually. The tension reached its peak. Richard's disappearance, the vanished workers, the inexplicable phenomena, everything converged on an inevitable point, in the heart of the basement, where nothing would be the same again. The partial opening of the basement and the unexpected manifestation inside the mansion put the team on high alert. Every sound, every shadow, and every creaking railing took on a new and unsettling meaning. It wasn't just the disappearance of Richard Halverson, but the confirmation that the house had a life of its own, or at least an awareness of something that defied human logic. The initial shock gave way to a series of instinctive reactions. Ethan began to walk close to Marcus, checking every corner with almost obsessive attention. Marcus, in turn, tried to remain calm while recording evidence of phenomena that defied any rational explanation. Laura, although focused on her objective, realized she needed to balance leadership and caution, as any wrong decision could be fatal. The consequences of the turning point were not limited to the physical environment. The mansion seemed to have altered the psychological behavior of everyone present. The perception of time became fluid. Minutes seemed like hours, and the heavy silence amplified the feeling of isolation. Each reaction from the team was amplified by fear, but also by the knowledge that they were dealing with something that could not be ignored. Small details began to gain meanings that would previously have been dismissed. A door that closed by itself, a slightly tilted painting, the echo of footsteps that seemed to have no origin. Each sign generated new hypotheses, new strategies, but also a constant tension that seeped into everyone's mind. Laura began to realize that the effects of the mansion were not only subjective, but also structural. Reviewing the records recovered by Marcus, she noticed patterns indicating conscious manipulation, altered cameras, displaced objects, amplified sounds in specific areas. The house not only responded to their presence, but seemed to direct their actions, induce decisions, and create situations that tested their physical and psychological limits. It was a chain reaction. Every move they made had a direct consequence, increasing the risk of harm or getting lost within the mansion's own architecture. Relationships within the team also changed. Ethan, normally rational, began to question his own sanity at critical moments. Doubt eroded his confidence, and he came to depend on Laura for bolder decisions. Marcus, despite his technical competence, felt a growing frustration. Each piece of evidence captured seemed insufficient. Each record only deepened the mystery. Laura, in turn, felt the weight of leading under intense psychological and physical pressure, trying to keep everyone focused while facing events that defied any previous training. The interpersonal tension became as complex as the investigation itself, adding layers of conflict and suspense. Among the most immediate consequences was the awareness that Richard's disappearance was not an isolated incident. The signs found suggested that the mansion acted as a catalyst, repeating historical patterns. Missing workers, long-time residents, and accounts of unexplained events formed a continuous narrative spanning decades. Every step taken by the team seemed to be observed and somehow anticipated. The feeling that they were playing a game, defined by invisible rules, heightened the urgency to unravel the secret before they became the next victims. At the same time, the pressure of time made each decision more critical. The team began to reorganize priorities, exploring fewer areas, focusing on the most relevant signs, and preparing strategies for possible confrontations with the unknown. Small, everyday actions, turning on flashlights, temporarily locking doors, signaling to each other, acquired survival significance. What was once journalistic investigation transformed into a struggle for safety, control, and understanding of an environment that seemed to react like a living organism. Despite the growing fear, moments of clarity emerged that helped the team move forward. Laura noticed patterns of movement in the house. Marcus managed to correlate visual records with historical events, and Ethan began to identify signs indicating safer locations to advance. Each reaction to the consequences not only shaped the course of the investigation, but also revealed the character and resilience of each member of the group. The mansion, hostile and unpredictable, functioned as a mirror, reflecting individual fears, strengths, and vulnerabilities. And above all, the consequences of that turning point reinforced the urgency of confronting the basement. Every previous step, every discovery, Every emotional reaction converged on that epicenter. The tension reached its peak, and everyone realized that the resolution of the mystery, and possibly their own survival, depended on their ability to directly confront what had remained hidden and unfathomable until then. The mansion, silent but alive, watched them, awaiting every movement, every hesitation, every choice. The confrontation with the basement irrevocably changed the team's dynamic. Laura realized that intelligence or courage alone wasn't enough. It was necessary to understand the environment as a whole, interpret subtle signs, and act with precision. Each decision became a test of personal growth. Ethan, who until then had been hesitant in the face of inexplicable manifestations, began to take calculated risks, confronting fears that had previously paralyzed him. His transformation wasn't quick, but it was visible. Fear ceased to be a block and became a tool, alerting him to dangers and guiding more strategic actions. Marcus, in turn, developed a sharper perception. While dealing with corrupted records and seemingly impossible to capture phenomena, he began to notice subtle patterns in the mansion's behavior. Every noise, every shadow, and every minute change in temperature ceased to be a random detail and became essential data for decision-making. This growth wasn't just technical, it was emotional. He needed to remain calm and trust his intuition, balancing logic and instinct in a situation where any mistake could be fatal. As a leader, Laura faced the challenge of harmonizing the team in the face of forces that could not be controlled, only interpreted. Her evolution manifested itself in decisions that balanced courage, patience, and strategy. Each step down the corridor, each approach to the basement, each observation of previously unnoticed patterns showed that she had transformed. No longer an investigator guided only by duty or curiosity, but a strategist capable of coordinating actions under extreme pressure, simultaneously dealing with the hostile environment and the human frailties of her team. Meanwhile, the mansion's environment continued to test limits. Minor accidents, unexpected displacements of objects, and sudden noises forced the team to quickly adapt their strategies. Each obstacle overcome not only increased the group's confidence, but also strengthened their perception that they could face the unknown without succumbing to panic. This growth manifested in quick reactions, silent communication between members, and the ability to anticipate movements within the mansion, transforming fear into active vigilance. The pressure of time and the intense pace of events forced the team to internalize lessons almost instinctively. Each step forward required coordination, reading signals, and executing without hesitation. Ethan began identifying escape routes and safe locations even before Laura signaled. Marcus started correlating visual evidence with historical patterns in the mansion, and Laura managed to anticipate traps that the house seemed to set to test limits. The transformation of each one was gradual, but evident. They were evolving, learning to survive not only physically, but mentally. Beyond individual growth, a profound sense of cohesion emerged. Every gesture, every glance, every decision became part of a collective strategy. The mansion, which until then seemed disorienting and manipulative, was now confronted with joint coordination and intelligence. The team learned to use the environment against itself. Narrow passages became observation points, suspicious noises turned into alerts, and fear was channeled into conscious action. Personal and collective growth intertwined, transforming each challenge into an opportunity for advancement. And as they approached the central point of the basement, each team member showed remarkable signs of evolution. Fear no longer paralyzed them. Uncertainty no longer confused them. The unknown no longer intimidated them without preparation. The overcoming was not only psychological, but also strategic. Each choice was based on experience gained from confronting the mansion itself. Each step was guided by learning from previous mistakes and successes. Each reaction reflected the transformation of ordinary individuals into people capable of facing a force that surpassed any known logic. At this stage, it became evident that growth wasn't just about survival, but about understanding. Laura realized that the mansion functioned almost as a test of perception and courage, challenging not only body, but mind and spirit. Each obstacle overcome strengthened their confidence that they could get to the bottom of the mystery, and that, in doing so, they would never be the same. The journey of overcoming transformed the confrontation with the unknown into an experience of intense evolution, definitively shaping the skills, courage, and perception of each member. The proximity of the basement brought with it an almost tangible tension, a density in the air that seemed to compress every breath. The team knew they were on the verge of a decisive moment, and every step needed to be calculated with precision. Laura mentally reviewed every discovery, every observed pattern, every sign the mansion had left up to that point. The fear persisted, but now it was controlled. It had transformed into vigilance and heightened attention, a silent weapon against the unpredictable elements of the place. Every corridor, every door, every shadow carried the weight of the imminence of the final confrontation, and every movement was strategic, meticulously planned. Ethan and Marcus, in turn, became almost extensions of Laura's perceptions. Ethan identified risks that others didn't notice, sections of the floor that could give way, unstable structures, and corridors that seemed to subtly alter the perception of distance. Marcus correlated images and records with historical signs of the mansion, identifying patterns that indicated areas of relative safety or potential traps. The preparation for the climax was not only physical, but also mental and strategic. Each action, each decision, each precautionary measure became part of a coordinated plan to face whatever awaited them in the heart of the basement. As they advanced, the mansion responded almost consciously. The air grew colder, the corridors seemed to lengthen and narrow simultaneously, and small sounds transformed into subtle warnings that something was watching their every move. The pressure of the environment tested the team's limits, forcing them to rely not only on each other, but also on their own intuition. The tension increased not abruptly, but in a steady progression, preparing each member for the climax with a psychological intensity that made every decision vital. Meanwhile, the team consolidated the scattered information from the subplots and previous discoveries. Every document found, every historical pattern, every disappearance record, and even the accounts of long-time residents were combined into a comprehensive understanding of what they might face. Laura realized that the climax would require not only courage, but also creativity. The mansion did not react to brute force, but to strategy, perception, and the ability to anticipate movements that defied conventional logic. This understanding shaped each member's approach, transforming fear into deliberate action. The preparation also included practical adjustments. Flashlights were tested and redistributed, alternative routes mapped, silent communication established, and protocols for unforeseen situations defined. Each measure taken reflected the learning acquired during days of exploration and minor confrontations, ensuring that the team was ready to react quickly and effectively. The mansion, however hostile it might be, now faced a cohesive, intelligent and strategically prepared team ready to deal with its manipulations. Furthermore, emotional tensions arose that reinforced the atmosphere of preparation. Ethan still struggled with moments of inner doubt, but learned to channel his anxiety into intense vigilance. Marcus faced frustrations upon realizing that not all logic worked in that space, but transformed that into determination to capture every visual and historical detail. Laura carried the weight of leadership. But now, with confidence reinforced by the group's evolution, the emotions, intense and complex, were not obstacles, but fuel that amplified the team's attention and strength. As they approached the final corridor before the basement, the mansion seemed to silently announce that the final confrontation was inevitable. Every detail, the creaking of the doors, the cold wind escaping through the broken windows, the shadows dancing on the walls, indicated that they were about to confront not only Richard's disappearance, but the very essence of the mystery the house held. The climax would not merely be a resolution of events, it would be an extreme test of courage, intelligence, and survival. And so, with each member aware of the role they would play and the forces they would face, the team advanced to the threshold of the basement. The mental, physical, and strategic preparation had been complete. Every step was taken with precision, every glance calculated, every breath controlled. The tension reached its peak, but so did a silent clarity. They were ready. The mansion awaited, but now they could not be surprised. The inevitable confrontation was about to begin, and nothing would be the same again. When the team finally reached the basement entrance, an almost palpable silence filled the air. The air felt denser, almost solid, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath, waiting for them to descend. Laura, in the lead, felt a mixture of adrenaline and caution, aware that every move now had immediate consequences. Ethan and Marcus followed close behind, alert to any signal, each sound reverberating amplified. There was no room for hesitation. The final confrontation would not forgive mistakes or doubts. The basement proved to be far more than any record had suggested. The space was vast, dark, and irregular, with secondary corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. Ancient objects, partially destroyed by time, were scattered chaotically, but each item seemed to have been placed there with deliberate intention, like pieces of an architectural and supernatural enigma. Laura realized that they were not just investigating, but entering the epicenter of a force that manipulated space, perception, and reality itself. Every step was a test. Every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own. Suddenly, a movement in the darkest corner of the basement caught their attention. It was Richard, or at least a projection of him. His image seemed distorted, as if fragments of his essence were trapped between the real world and something inexplicable. The team froze, unable to distinguish whether he was a ghost, a manipulation of the mansion, or something even more incomprehensible. Laura realized that every disappearance, every observed phenomenon, culminated in that moment. It was the peak of tension, where past, present, and immediate danger met. In an instant, the mansion reacted. Doors that had been closed opened violently, chains fell from ancient beams, and a cold wind swept through the space, carrying indistinct whispers. The presence that had previously manifested itself indirectly was now felt tangibly, a force that defied all logic and seemed to determine the limits of the team's survival. Ethan almost lost his balance, but Laura held him, keeping his focus on the objective: to understand and neutralize whatever was influencing Richard and the previous disappearances. The confrontation was simultaneously physical and psychological. Richard's projection began to move, reacting to the team's actions as if it had its own consciousness. Each attempt at contact, each gesture from the team seemed to trigger changes in the environment. Shadows lengthened, objects shifted, and doors slammed shut. Marcus quickly documented everything, noticing patterns that suggested the mansion responded not only to their presence, but to their intentions. Laura understood that the key lay not in brute force or technology, but in strategy, perception, and above all, courage combined with quick decision-making. At the most critical moment, Laura managed to identify a pattern. The presence, or manifestation, seemed to center on an ancient altar in the center of the basement. She instructed Ethan and Marcus to surround the space in a synchronized manner. With calculated movements, Laura approached the altar, observing every detail, every symbol, and every object. It was at that instant that Richard's projection began to merge with the environment, revealing that his disappearance had been the result of a direct interaction with the mansion, a kind of architectural and supernatural trap created over decades. The truth was clear and terrifying. The mansion not only imprisoned but transformed the perception, reality, and essence of those who ventured deep into its corridors. The climax arrived when Laura, with a combination of courage, perception, and strategy, managed to activate an ancient mechanism that partially stabilized the environment. Richard's projection began to become tangible, its form gradually solidifying, and the mansion reacted with tremors, creaks, and a series of phenomena that defy any rational explanation. The team understood that at that moment, their actions decided not only their survival, but also the possibility of finally revealing the truth about the previous disappearances and the mystery that had surrounded the house for decades. As the metaphorical dust began to settle, everyone realized that something had irrevocably changed. The mansion, once hostile and unpredictable, now became less aggressive, as if recognizing that the team had faced its final test. Richard, in flesh and blood, or what remained of his consciousness, was partially free, but forever marked by the experience. The tension of the climax not only resolved the central conflict, but transformed each member of the team. Courage, intelligence, and personal achievement were pushed to the limit, completely redefining the course of their lives. As the dust from the climax began to settle, the mansion revealed a different kind of silence, no longer menacing, but heavy, as if bearing the weight of decades of mysteries it had held. Laura, Ethan, and Marcus realized the space still felt alive, but no longer hostile. There was a sense of tacit acceptance. The confrontation had tested every skill, courage, and instinct of the team, but it had also brought clarity to the true nature of Richard's disappearance. He hadn't been the victim of an accident or negligence. He had been drawn into the center of an architectural and supernatural secret that manipulated perception and reality in unimaginable ways. Richard, partially recovered, watched the team with an expression of restrained relief and a profound weariness that revealed the intensity of the experience he had lived through. He explained in a trembling voice how the mansion functioned almost like a conscious organism, learning from each intruder, reacting to fears and exploiting weaknesses. Every step the team had taken was crucial not only to recover Richard, but to prevent others from becoming victims of repeated patterns of disappearance that stretched for decades. The truth, though shocking, offered a resolution to a mystery that seemed unsolvable. As they examined the basement and the records detailing previous events, each team member realized the depth of their own transformation. Ethan, once paralyzed by fear, now displayed calculated confidence and constant vigilance. Marcus, who struggled with frustration and doubt, now demonstrated patience and keen perception, capable of decoding complex patterns. Laura, in turn, became the embodiment of conscious and strategic leadership, balancing courage, intelligence, and empathy. They all understood that the confrontation had not only revealed the mansion's secret, but had also shaped them, reinforcing skills, perception, and resilience in irreversible ways. The consequences extended beyond immediate survival. The mansion, though still mysterious, no longer wielded the same manipulative power. The subplots, the previous disappearances, and the inexplicable manifestations found partial resolution, not through complete understanding, but through the balance the team managed to strike between action, perception, and courage. The feeling of victory was not only about Richard's recovery, but about the ability to face the unknown and emerge transformed, with a sharper mind and a firmer spirit. Furthermore, the surrounding environment began to show signs of relative normality. Unstable structures were consolidated, displaced objects returned to stable positions, and the corridors, once labyrinthine and disorienting, now seemed less treacherous. The team understood that, although the mansion never ceased to be an imposing presence, there were defined limits that could be respected and understood. The resolution brought relief, but also the awareness that some forces remain beyond human reach, demanding respect and prudence. Finally, the group gathered in front of the central altar in the basement, contemplating the space that had been the stage for terror, tension, and surprising discoveries. Each carried invisible scars, intense memories, and a profound understanding of what they had faced. The narrative of the mansion, which had previously seemed endless and uncontrollable, now possessed a clear line of cause and effect: disappearance, confrontation, overcoming, and resolution. The story reached a point of emotional and logical closure, allowing the team to breathe, reflect, and understand the scope of what they had achieved. The conclusion wasn't just about surviving, but about learning from the environment, from mistakes and successes, from fears and courage. Each character emerged transformed, not only physically, but emotionally and intellectually. The central conflict had been resolved, and each character's personal arc found a satisfying closure, consistent with the challenges faced and the lessons learned. The mansion remained imposing, but now no longer as an absolute enemy, but rather as an enigma that had finally been decoded, at least in part by those who dared to confront it. Months had passed since the final confrontation in the mansion's basement. Laura, Ethan, and Marcus continued to reflect on the experience, each carrying vivid memories and psychological scars that would never completely disappear. Richard, now recovered, had returned to his routine, but carried with him a silent weight. The knowledge that the mansion held secrets that might never be fully uncovered. The team stayed in touch, meeting periodically to analyze records, discuss patterns, and keep alive the understanding that some mysteries require constant vigilance. Despite the investigation being closed, the mansion remained a symbol of strength, danger, and transformation. What seemed like an inert space had revealed itself to be a catalyst for personal growth, courage, and keen perception. For each team member, the experience left indelible marks, but also the certainty that they faced the unknown with intelligence and strategy, emerging stronger, more alert, and prepared for future challenges. The memory of the terror experienced coexisted with the pride of overcoming it. In the silence of the nights that followed, Laura still mentally reviewed every detail of the basement, every pattern she had identified, and every reaction from the mansion. She knew that, although they had survived, the environment continued to exist, full of potential to confuse and challenge anyone who dared to enter its corridors again. The experience not only solved a mystery, but also planted the seed of vigilance and constant preparation. A reminder that courage and attention are essential tools in the face of the unknown. The story of the mansion, Richard's disappearance, and the team's courage doesn't have to end here. Every detail, every discovery, and every challenge faced is an invitation to reflect on how the unknown can test limits and reveal unexpected strengths within us. If you followed this journey, consider how courage, perception, and determination can transform seemingly impossible situations into opportunities for growth and learning. Share your impressions, discuss theories about the secrets that may still exist in the mansion, and tell us how you would react to a mystery that defies logic and reality. Engaging, questioning, and debating not only enriches the understanding of the story, but also allows each reader or viewer to connect emotionally with the characters and the decisions that shape their destiny. The adventure doesn't end in the last paragraph. It continues in the imagination and participation of each individual.